Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week's show is going to focus on the NSA and 9/11. The 9/11 Commission barely investigated the NSA, even though its mandate was to give a, quote, full and complete accounting, end quote, of 9/11. There is so much that we don't know regarding the NSA and 9/11 that we need to know. Okay, this is John, and I'm here with Mr. Thomas Drake. Mr. Drake, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to read his bio. Thomas Drake is a former senior executive with the National Security Agency, a United States Air Force and Navy veteran, CIA intelligence analyst, computer software expert, and whistleblower. While at NSA, he blew the whistle on multi-billion-dollar programmatic fraud, waste, and abuse, the critical loss and cover-up of 9/11 intelligence, government wrongdoing, and a dragnet electronic mass surveillance and data mining program conducted on a vast scale by the NSA with the approval of the White House after 9/11. Mr. Drake argued that this program violated and subverted the Constitution as well as individual sovereignty and privacy while weakening national security and fundamentally eroding our civil liberties. In April 2010, he was charged by the U.S. Department of Justice with a 10 felony count Espionage Act indictment, facing 35 years in prison and declared an enemy of the state. All 10 original charges were dropped in July 2011 after Mr. Drake pled to a single misdemeanor count of exceeding the authorized use of a government computer with no fine or prison time. He is the 2011 recipient of the Ridenhour Truth Telling Prize, and with Jesselyn Radack, the co-recipient of the 2011 Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence Award and the 2012 Hugh M. Hefner First Amendment Award. He was also a visiting professor of strategic leadership and information strategies at the National Defense University and the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Previous to NSA, he was a principal in a couple of dot-coms. He has 12 years of industry experience in change leadership, senior management, organizational leadership and development, quality assurance, software and systems engineering, having analyzed over 150 million lines of code, learning strategies, acquisition and program management, operations and technology lifecycle integration as a contractor and consultant with both government and commercial clients, including Fortune 500 and Fortune 50 companies. He was at Booz Allen Hamilton as a management, strategy, and technology consultant and software quality engineer from 1991 to 1998. He served in the military for some 14 years as an active-duty U.S. Air Force aircrew member performing cryptologic linguist duties at the RC-135 Airborne Reconnaissance Platform and as a mission crew supervisor on the EC-130H electronic warfare mission during the latter years of the Cold War. He also served in the U.S. Navy as a reserve commissioned all-source intelligence officer assigned to the National Military Joint Intelligence Center at the Pentagon, serving on the ELINT, Terrorism, and Middle East North Africa desks in the 1990s. He also had a short stint as an imagery intelligence analyst at the CIA in the late 80s. Mr. Drake is the founder and senior leader of No Power Systems LLC, a boutique leadership, development, and executive consulting firm formed in 2008 and focused on business intelligence, IT, corporate governance, risk management, operations analysis, systems thinking, strategic advising, and deep learning through people, process, and technology, expanding capacity, increasing performance, and enhancing social and relational well-being for individuals, teams, and organizations. His outreach and speaking expertise center on delivering dynamic, interactive, and compelling content in the areas of strategic leadership, international relations, contemporary international problems, professional ethics, executive management, business intelligence and decision support systems, resource strategy, complex systems, social and technical, human relations, dynamics of the information and knowledge age, information management, organizational sustainability, executive leadership, 21st century issues, governance and decision making, the Constitution and civil liberties, as well as whistleblowing. His particular area of expertise is the strategic and global perspective while placing events, people, trends, and movements in the larger context and finding the meaning and the connections and making sense of them such that one can take the practical action necessary to execute the mission and the business in challenging times under adverse conditions and with constant uncertainty. He has also focused on a key, quote, emergent, end quote, strategically competitive best practice of relationship leadership involving dynamically evolving social ecology and social network systems. This highly innovative approach involves real-time learning and feedback, creating the very conditions for both individual and organizational well-being and accomplishment while also achieving sustainable results in the marketplace and for social activism and change. He now writes, speaks, and teaches around the world on whistleblowing, constitutional rights, civil liberties, secrecy, surveillance, and abusive corporate and government power. He has dedicated himself to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that was a rather extensive bio, but you deserve the full treatment, sir, so I had no problems with that. And after listening to it, I can say that if I had some place of employment, you would most certainly be hired.
It's been a challenge finding any work other than where I've been for the past number of years. So,
right. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, let's get started.
Sure.
I'm going to read the first question to you, and that is, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Wow. Yeah, I've been asked that a number of times over the last number of years, and it was my first day on the job. I had been hired into a special outside hiring program by General Michael V. Hayden, and I was reporting to the number 3 person at NSA, who at the time was Maureen Baginski, the Director of Signals Intelligence, the largest single organization at NSA. It's the operational side of the agency. And the agreement was I would show up, which I did at dark 30, and I would meet her in her office, and I would shadow her. Her calendar had become my calendar, or I should say my calendar was now hers. And I would wander around with her, go to different meetings for about 30 days or so, just to get a sense and a feel for all of the myriad of responsibilities and challenges she had. I was hired in as a change leader. In fact, my actual title was senior change leader. And that was my function. And I was looking at process, I was looking at management, I was looking at technology. The reason I was even hired was because about a dozen of us have been brought in under huge pressure from Congress in particular. The NSA was falling behind the times, it wasn't keeping up, it was becoming less relevant, and it was having great difficulty meeting the digital age. It's one of the ironic realities of NSA back there in those years, especially post-Cold War. One, it had identity crisis. 2, is trying to find a new mission. But 2, the internet had gone right by it. NSA had pretty much decided internet was not worth, there were no secrets worth knowing on internet because it was all open. So here I was on the morning of September 11th, 2001, and the first meeting that I attended is she was speaking to a technical advisory group that had come up from the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they were wanting to hear from her. She was what some would refer to as a talking head. Some use that term pejoratively, others actually with great admiration. She was one of the few at NSA, given that management was not a core competency, neither was speaking. Remember, NSA listened, it didn't speak most of the time.
Right.
So she was giving a talk, I would say maybe more of an explanation or an attempted explanation in the form of a story as to what all these billions, what would we get for all these billions that are being spent on this huge program called Trailblazer. And the stakeholders, Congress and others, were having great difficulty getting their arms around what would the nation and national security actually receive as from the largesse of all these billions. And this is what I remember. I remember, I was sitting in a chair up against the inner wall, and there's an inner hallway, and her executive assistant opened up the corner door in the inner office and said some freak accident, one of the World Trade Center towers had been hit. No one really thought much about it. It's like, and I remember about the bomber that flew into the Empire State Building,
right,
because of weather and fog back in the 30s. Not long after that, the same executive assistant opens the same door and says that the second World Trade Center tower has been hit by an airplane. And I remember I stood up, I said, "America's under attack." I actually exclaimed that.
Right.
And then the next 4 months are a blur. It was clearly, pretty much the entire NSA emptied, both contractors and civilians. We did not know at that time, mid to late morning, if there were any other targets. There was suspicions that there might be. We knew that they found out there was other planes in the air that had been hijacked. One in particular, a couple apparently had been aborted. And for precaution's sake, other than those that were assigned to crisis response teams, everybody was asked or directed to go home, including myself. And I remember spending the rest of the day parked in front of the television, and even to this day, just the replay of the towers coming down over and over and over again.
Right.
Drifted off, took a very fitful nap. It was late that evening, very early the next morning. I remember waking up not too long after midnight, calling into work. I had a special number to call, and they'd say, "Hey, you need to get in here, Tom." And so
This was at midnight?
This was a little after midnight. It was probably around 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And then, the next 4 months, we're talking, 18-hour days.
Right.
As the government ramped up in its response. What I didn't know, of course, on that day, it's a day frozen for those of us that were there. It's interesting that it's receding into history, and there's people I work with now that there are 20-somethings that only briefly know about a 9/11 or seeing some image on a magazine or on television. They don't actually know or have the experience. I mean, it's 13 years on now, and yet for me it seems just like yesterday.
It's very weird to talk to somebody who's in their 20s and was 10 years old on the day of.
Yeah.
And I've spoken with students, and I've asked them specifically what they've been taught in school about 9/11, and they say they're basically just told or taught about the day of. There's no context given, or anything like that. So you're right, it's very weird. So go ahead.
Not just weird, but for me, almost 3,000 people were murdered.
Yep.
And during the course of the day, as I was home before I went back to work very early the next morning, I can remember these really bad flashbacks. And I'm just going to give you context. Speaking of context, you mentioned in my bio that I used to be intel officer of the Navy, and I was assigned to the Joint Intelligence Center. It's the National Military Joint Intelligence Center at the Pentagon. The head reports to the J2. He's the lead military intelligence officer. Reports up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During my time there, from 92 to 97. I was assigned to several desks, and for a period of about 18 months, I was actually on the terrorism desk. That's what it was called. It was in the alert center. And I was there during the period in which they tried to drop the World Trade Center towers the first time with truck bombs.
Right.
And we were sending out reports that, and this is where I first got to know about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We were in the loop, with Arab linguists. We had the translations from the tapes that were going around, the fatwas that he was issuing. And it was clear that this guy and his movement, which was clearly transnational, was serious. And they had huge, let's just say they had a lot they didn't like about the West and even their own culture in terms of the forms of government that had taken place over the intervening decades and centuries. And they had a huge bone to pick, and it was clear from all their talks, and yet we were sending out these reports, and they're essentially going into the circular file. No one really seemed to care. And I remember after the World Trade Center towers, they attempted to drop them with truck bombs, and they were damaged and they had injuries, that we were issuing reports that this is just an opening shot, that they're going to be coming back. And they looked at the World Trade Center towers and other Western symbols as something to attack, as something to harm, and recognizing that it would cause a lot of publicity. And we were issuing these reports.
Right.
And I even to this day, I'm going to relate to you, this is history just ringing in my ears, but the ringing is not drowning out the truth of what I'm about to share. I remember the J2. He's a general. He comes down, 2-star general. He comes down to our center. He actually comes down to the center and
to the terrorism
desk.
The
alert center, and there's all these different desks, and he's looks at us and looks at me and he says, "Yeah, I'm seeing all the reports you're sending out." And he says, "Who cares? Who cares about a raghead spouting off fatwas in the desert underneath the fig tree? Who cares?"
Right.
And I was just flabbergasted because it was clear that the intelligence complex. Remember, this is 93. This is not even a year, after barely a year. After the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1992, they were still struggling with who's the next enemy, what's our identity, the Cold War is over, what does this mean? And it was just dismissed, this asymmetric threat. And although terrorism had been in full flower, so to speak, with hijackings, as we know from previous history, they just was dismissing all this, that it was inconsequential in terms of any threats or potential threats. And we continued to reports. We said that we were predicting, this is intelligence. Classic intelligence is about indications and warning, and we warned in our reports that this group was serious and that they were going to return, and associated movements. We actually said that, and I don't take solace in saying this, because we failed to convince command authorities and others to take action. And 8 years later, a little over 8 years later, guess what?
Now, I wonder if one of the reasons why this individual didn't care or whatever. I mean, at the time, I think we were still working with the Mujahideen, and Osama bin Laden, I think in the Caucasus and elsewhere. I don't know. That's just speculation. So your position at the NSA was a change leader, you said?
Yeah, I was hired in as a senior executive. So that's the top tier. It's about 7,500 senior executive across the government.
Right.
I was in a management leadership position. And I was hired straight in. I was literally dropped in at a very senior level, reporting to the number 3 person. So, wide purview, And a whole lot of stuff began to happen. I mean, it would take quite a while to unfold the full history. It has many, many threads, many, many backstories, and the historical context is critical to understand it. But I give you the example of where I was in '93 to help at least provide some context for 2001, because it was clearly not considered a real threat. And although by the time we get to '98, George Tenet himself, as director of the CIA, is saying the system is blinking red. Actually said that. I remember seeing the reports in '98. He was ignored as well. No one was really on this. No one was. There were a few little offices here and there. There's probably about 20 people max. If you looked on 9/10 to see the number of people that were actually working the counterterrorism target, or as space, as we would say, it was about 20 people.
In the NSA, you're saying?
In all of NSA, about 20 people. They were even focused on the problem.
Now, your story as a whistleblower is very extensive. So rather than ask you individual questions about this or that, I'm just going to let you tell your story. And for my own curiosity, I would like to hear about the Espionage Act and the FBI raids against you, staffer Diane Rourke, and NSA whistleblowers William Binney and Kirk Wiebe.
Yeah, well, that all happened a number of years later. Okay, so
okay,
and primarily for sheer retaliation and reprisal, retribution. But that's part of the deeper story. What happened after 9/11 is, I mean, I'll just give you the quick thumbnail. I'm just going to give you the thumbnail. I can't give you all in the time we have, because it's an extraordinarily disturbing story, and obviously I lived it, and I was there, and have intimate knowledge of what happened and what the response was, both publicly as well, and then the dirty knowledge of what happened in the deepest of secrecy, and using 9/11 as an excuse. So right after 9/11, the workforce, we always call the people that did the real work, were called the workforce, interestingly enough, at NSA, or some would call them the rank and file, to use industrial age language.
Right.
Took it really hard. It's important to note for your listeners, and I've said this in the past in other venues and other fora, the people that do the real work in NSA knew the NSA and the intelligence community, the whole national defense effort, had failed the nation, because our primary responsibility as an intelligence agency was to provide indications and warning. And we had failed the nation. We had not done our duty under the preamble of the Constitution, which is one of the two primary functions of government. It's one, provide for the general welfare, the other one is provide for the common defense. We had failed to provide for the common defense. We had not kept people out of harm's way, and not just Americans, but innocent foreign nationals were murdered on 9/11. Workforce took it really hard. That's a whole story in itself.
I've heard about that in the CIA, in parts of the CIA and in the FBI as well.
No, and because of my role and other functions, I had broad outreach to others, and others in the rest of the government, particularly in the intelligence arena, and it was clear that their own people and other people that do the real work in other agencies related to intelligence were taking it really hard, and psychologically it was extraordinarily difficult. And so, what do you tell your neighbors? What do you tell your friends? What do you say, right? Here, the homeland, I don't like that word, but the domestic U.S. territory had actually been attacked, and it was an extraordinary loss. And of course, the images weren't helping, as we for those of us that were there that know. So, but as we went around, and I was with Maureen Baginski as she was the signals intelligence director. We were having these sessions with people in different offices and attempting to console them, attempting to help provide explanation. But I remember a phrase that she used and I know in part she regretted it later. A very conflicted person, by the way, just given her, her history and the fact that she had been there as a career. Here she is, a very powerful position at NSA, saying, "Oh no, 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We'll get all the money we want, and some."
Yeah.
And I knew in her saying that, okay, I knew in her saying that we were already headed in the wrong direction. That NSA leadership was going to project this in reverse, and knew that Congress would basically open up the pocketbooks, representing the American taxpayer, of course, and just write really big checks. And that's precisely what started happening. And that's a whole story in itself, okay? I have many, many anecdotes, very disturbing anecdotes about how that played out over the next several years. So you have that as an explanation, right? Which is not an explanation. It was simply going to be used as an excuse to recover all the losses from the peace dividend post-Cold War.
Right.
Right. So what else was happening? Well, this was obviously not just a minor crisis. This was a historical crisis that had really altered the equation in terms of NSA. And I know that NSA's response, as a classic organizational response, is, oh, we need a lot more bodies on the problem. So the 20 I mentioned that were focused on counterterrorism jumped to over 400 within the space of just a couple of months. Whole new offices were formed, all new crisis centers, response teams, you name it. That's a whole story in itself. We were asked, I was asked to lead an effort, enterprise level, to put anything we had into the fight. This was a directive from Tenet, across the intelligence community. I put community in quotes. Put anything you have in the fight, doesn't matter what it is. If it's in the labs, prototype, test bed, just put it out there. And ran across a number of solutions, some that were near complete, some that were finished, some that were ready for operational deployment, others that were still being worked on as prototypes. But NSA, again, at management level, became incredibly resistant to employing any of this, because anything that could be used to help pursue the real threat, and obviously there were threats that needed to be pursued in light of what had happened, that was crystal clear, would make them look bad. So you have this whole weird psychology going on, that because we had failed, don't do anything that would actually make us look like we failed. Going inside the institution, and institutional prerogatives began to quickly return within the space of just a month or two. We had efforts to stand up, as I was in charge of putting together a centralized web server, a distributed web server, where it was a centralized location where people could just typing in a web address and then make it one of their favorites, so when they came into for their shift for the day, they would get the very latest news to inform them regarding what was going on, what was happening, updates they needed to know about. All this is ongoing. But then there's this whole other parallel thing going on at NSA. And I'm just going to summarize it, because, again, I could talk for hours on this. But I found out very disturbing information, both directly and indirectly, that equipment that was normally outward-facing, equipment that would normally be used for traditional foreign intelligence, was now being turned on U.S. networks directly.
Right.
I heard about a program called Stellar Wind that was being just whispered by people. There was an effort that I was involved with. Again, I'm jumping around here, but I'm just to give you a sense of this, where I and a colleague of mine that worked directly with me, we were actually assisting the FBI in facilitating the affidavit process for the secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, where the probable cause affidavit information is brought before the court so they can issue a warrant to go after, a U.S. person, resident, legal alien, or a U.S. corporation, if they're suspected of engaging in harm against the United States or the national security. we were suddenly taken off that effort. I remember confronting my supervisor, Marie McGinsky, who said that they've gone with a different solution. I confronted the lead attorney at NSA after I just said, "What are we doing?" To my supervisor. We have to have a warrant. You know, it's the prime directive of NSA. You cannot spy an American, surveil an American electronically without a warrant. Although there was conditions for hot pursuit and the equivalent of wartime, but you still have to go back for a warrant. Right. I confronted the lead attorney the first week in October regarding what NSA was doing, and it was an extraordinarily chilling conversation. He said, "You don't understand, Mr. Drake. The White House has approved the program." And as soon as he said the White House, the hair was going up on the back of my neck, because I'm remembering what Nixon said back in the 70s. You know, if the president says it's okay, then it's legal.
Well, Dick Cheney started to say that after a few years.
Well, 5 days. And I remember 5 days after 9/11. I mean, I remember this is like a blur, but I can pick out all the distinct events. 5 days after 9/11. In fact, I just listened to his, for the first time in a number of years, actually watched the tape again on broadcast television, where he says we're going to go to the dark side.
Right.
Sources and methods. And I knew that was very troubling. I says, and knowing Cheney's history, that this would be a golden opportunity to do other things, because already getting very early wind, even as early as 5 days after, that other authorities were being authorized for NSA. Of course, General Hayden was making frequent trips down to the White House Situation Room and other locations. What I did know when I confronted the lead attorney, and he said, "No, NSA is the executive agent." They always called it the program. It's all legal. All the lawyers have looked at it. All legal, right? White House, we're the executive agent. White House has approved it. Don't ask any more questions. And although I pursued that with him for a bit, he simply would not. He shut me down. And clearly I recognized when I put the phone down that I was now staring into the abyss. I was staring into the very abyss that Frank Church warned the nation about in 1975.
Right.
That under the excuse and under the failure, a systemic failure to protect the nation, they were going to use 9/11 as an excuse. And I will use a really, really strong language now, but in the deepest of secrecy. In fact, it ended up being protected as an extraordinarily deep state secret, that the United States government would willfully, as an act of commission, not omission, violate the Fourth Amendment and subvert the Constitution on an extraordinarily mass scale.
Wow.
And I recognize the paranoia and the fear. I recognize that in compensating for the failure, right? And others have had other interpretations. But remember, I'm speaking as someone who was there, who confronted the senior leadership on this, okay, and became aware of some really, really dirty knowledge about this, about all that took place in those early days, weeks, and months after 9/11 that was rapidly expanded, that the United States was now being turned into the equivalent of a foreign nation for dragnet, blanket, electronic surveillance on a scale that we had never seen before, but on a scale that no other nation in the world had ever seen before. And in terms of sheer scope and scale, and with the direct cooperation of a number of leading telcos, internet service providers, and then later on internet providers, data brokers, financial institutions, etc.
Right.
What do? My moment of truth was that first week in October, because if I had remained silent, I would be an accessory to a crime. If I remained silent, then I would be denying that I was eyewitness to the subversion of the Constitution. And remember, what was so important about the Constitution? It was the thing it's supposed to make us different. It was the grand experiment. And although it had many faults and foibles, it was an extraordinary document based on the uneven progress of liberty and freedom over the millennia. But I was certainly not going to stand by and simply break the oath that I had taken 4 times in my government career, twice in the military, once at CIA, and the fourth time as an NSA senior executive to support and defend the Constitution. And what I was confronted by was I am now having to defend the Constitution against my own government. And I decided that I would do my best with all I had, knowing that the odds were long and the chances were slim, that I would defend the Constitution against my own government from within. And I did that until I couldn't do it anymore. And I say that with some emotion because I failed. I actually failed on behalf of America and you and the Americans. I failed I failed. I will, and I've had to accept that because it was clear who was going. The order was given, and I have to say it this way: the order was given by the White House, in league with General Hayden and others, to effect turning the extraordinary, the incredible power of NSA onto the United States. And obviously it could not do that without the cooperation by hook or by crook, some cases coerced, with certain companies. Right. It also involved other parts of government, which some people still don't fully appreciate, including the FBI. So here I am, and of course, I grew up in the 70s. Context for you. I grew up in the 70s as a very young teenager. I was there. I remember the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and a president resigning his office. I remember Daniel Ellsberg, talking about what was at stake. Right. The bright and shining light of Vietnam. I remember, seniors burning their draft cards in 1971, the back parking lot when I was a freshman in high school. Here I am, and I remember the Pike Church committee hearings, the Rockefeller Commission, and all those reports. You go back and read those. It's just like, wow. And a lot of that, there was then 2 intel committees were formed, standing committees to provide oversight of the secret side of government because it had gotten out of hand, in the intervening decades. And then this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was a compromise in itself, right? And yet the government had unchained itself in the Constitution. That's what had happened after 9/11. No one knew it, except for very, very few, especially in those first 2 years. And I went through every channel that existed. I was a witness before, material witness and whistleblower before 2 9/11 congressional investigations. I gave him everything I knew, and the worst part of it for me was discovering, as I found out right after 9/11, I even confronted Maureen Baginski with a report that had been finished by NSA, finished report, many, many months before 9/11, basically breaking out the full scope of Al-Qaeda associated movements. And it was never shared with the rest of the intelligence agencies, nor was it ever given to the National Command Authorities to take action. That was just one report amongst a number of them.
What did that report state specifically?
It exposed the full network. It showed how the network was operating, how it metastasized, who was associated with it. It was the best of NSA. I mean, this is the kicker, the very best that the Americans would expect, that that those in secret have a special obligation to their own citizenry to protect the nation. And here was the finest, the finest that I worked with. And I've been in the system for a long time. Remember, I listened in on East Germany and Warsaw Pact countries back during the latter years of the Cold War, and did electronic warfare. And yet here I was, my own country now was taking on activities that I not only did I object to, but in violation of the law. But the law no longer seemed to matter. The phrase that I kept hearing in those weeks and months after 9/11, you don't understand, Tom. And it was all summarized by the lead attorney. The lead attorney said, "You don't understand. We just need the data. We live in extraordinary times, and exigent conditions apply." Exigent. It's a really interesting word in the English language. Exigent, meaning all means necessary to confront the threat. Right. Yeah, and all means necessary meant that the Constitution was in the way. And I can tell you right here, I can tell your listener right here, none of this is necessary. We never had to go to the dark side, like Cheney said. The very best of American engineering innovation had already solved this problem years earlier. Knew how do you make sense of and find meaning in large amounts of data. Already solved that problem. Didn't take billions to do it. Had been solved for $3 million, $3.2 million on a program called Thin Thread that was rejected by NSA out of hand. And by the way, during this period, Congress actually passed legislation signed into law by President Bush in early 2002, directing NSA to deploy Thin Thread to the 18 most critical counterterrorism sites across the world. They never did so. They actually defied the law, but so, no penalties.
The Thin Thread program was a $3.2 million program versus the other
$4 billion plus.
$4 billion plus.
It had solved that problem, which was the program. Unfortunately, was the corporate solution that was launched with great fanfare by Hayden back in the spring of 2002. I mean, sorry, it's spring of 2000, about a year after he got there, after he commissioned some studies. And it was a $4 billion plus program before 9/11, okay? And nothing was going to stand in its way. And so this little pipsqueak of a program, for $3.2 million that had basically solved, met all the core requirements of Trailblazer, didn't stand a chance. Not only did it solve the core challenges of that Trailblazer was supposed to solve, but it also provided superior intelligence. And as I found out, much to my horror, the program itself was capable of finding data that was not connected. Meaning you could take it and bring unassociated, we call it unassociated data, unassociated information, electronically or in whatever form you could get it electronically, and make connections on a level and a scale that had just not been ever done before. All of this was rejected because it made the corporate solution look bad. It was such a small program. It didn't cost much money. I mean, this is just one of a number of programs that were soundly rejected or pushed aside by NSA. And of course, what's happening after 9/11? Congress is coming to NSA, effectively saying, how big a check do you want us to write? And what number do you want to put on the left?
Which goes back to what that individual said on the day of 9/11.
Yeah, we're going to get all the money we want and then some. I remember about a little over a year after 9/11, it was a gala celebration, the 50th anniversary of NSA's creation. And here's context for your listeners. People have this idea that somehow NSA was brought into existence by Congress or a congressional legislature. It was not. It was literally created by the stroke of a secret pen held by President Truman in 1952 as a military intelligence agency. It was not part of the National Security Act in 1947, which actually created the CIA and brought the Department of Defense into existence and the Air Force. It was a wholly secret military foreign, quote unquote, foreign intelligence agency. Right?
Right.
People need to know that, because what happened after 9/11, when I say that the government unchained itself from the very Constitution it was bound to uphold, support, and defend, is that it was increasingly militarizing all this under what became known as the unitary executive theory. Ugh. Under Article 2, that the commander-in-chief power of the president trumped everything.
Right.
And unilateral power. Of course, we've never declared war. The last time we declared war, actually, was in you go back to 41, early 42, was the last time Congress actually declared war. We've never declared war since World War II, formally, although that power is reserved to the Congress. And even under the War Powers Act, there's supposed to be these notifications. Mm-hmm. The AUMF, authorization to use military force, was the justifying document for a whole host of things. But ultimately, it was in secret. It was Article 2. It was the commander-in-chief, the head of the military. And this is what I find extraordinarily chilling, is that much of what took place in secret, again, going to the dark side, as Cheney said, in no uncertain terms, was all done under the Article 2 commander-in-chief powers. And that meant that everything else stood aside. And that meant that everything else took a backseat. And whatever orders were given, and I have to say it this way, whatever orders were issued or given by the commander-in-chief through his various executive branch minions and leaders, you would obey. And if you chose not to obey, then guess what? You were disobeying a direct order. And if you disobeyed a direct order, then you'd be severely punished. Now, of course, as a civilian, you know, I'm still having been a former officer in the Navy, commissioned. I was well aware of orders, but under Article 2 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you're only obligated to follow lawful orders, cannot be unconstitutional, cannot violate law or statute, cannot violate the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and you actually have an obligation to question any order that may or may not be lawful. Even if it is, you still have the right to question it. Right. But here, you weren't to question any of this because the decisions had already been made. So you can imagine the space that I and a few others are in. What do you do when you're now confronting the reality that under the very definition of high crimes and misdemeanors, although this is quote unquote post 9/11, the White House is engaged in subversion, okay? Right. But it doesn't matter because the threat to the homeland is so severe, and because almost 3,000 people are murdered, we can get away with anything. Whatever we need to do, we're going to do it. Well, and that's precisely what happened. And so I knew in October, that first week in October, you know, this is before the Patriot Act, is before any of this other stuff, right? I knew that the decision that was made in the deepest of secrecy would have enormous downstream consequences. Right. And it would all eventually come out in some manner. But I also knew that I had an obligation to support and defend the Constitution. Because if I didn't, I'd be breaking my oath. And that oath took primacy over everything else. Right. And so, you know, I went the 2 9/11 congressional investigations. I gave them everything I knew about, we can get into that. I think that you're probably going to ask me some questions about that and what NSA actually did know but chose to cover up. Well, keep from a number of investigators, including the 9/11 Commission. Well,
with regards to the two investigations, there was the Joint Congressional Inquiry and another one. You're aware of the story of the NSA leaks made supposedly by Republican Richard Shelby, even though he denies it, during the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11?
Yes, I am.
What do you have to say about that? Anything?
Well, they were pretty close to the truth. You know, he was sort of taken out back and told to, you know, shut up. Okay.
Right.
You know, it's interesting. I'll just parenthetically insert this. There's a speech and debate clause, which is an extraordinary part of the Constitution, where, as Mike Gravel did with the Pentagon Papers, which I remember him reading them in, right, to the congressional record, about 4,000 pages worth. Mm-hmm. A senator can go into the well and actually, under the speech and debate clause, and without censure or sanction, say just about, you know, short of asking for insurrection, right? Can say anything, and no one did. Okay.
Right.
Now you could argue, without doing the well thing, right, did release certain information that was considered kind of sensitive.
Right.
All right. And did get in part censored by the intelligence establishment, because he was clearly saying things about fault and blame, and that was the last thing that they wanted to do. There was this agreement, by the way, I say this unspoken in terms of unwritten agreement, and certainly spoken in secret, this unwritten agreement that we are not going to accept any failure, and we will protect our institutional equities.
Wow. Yeah. Well, the leaks, that, just so people know, there were two communications intercepted a day or two before 9/11. One of them was tomorrow is 0 hour, and another one I think is The Match Begins, or something to that effect.
Right.
Richard Shelby leaked it to the media, and the thing that happened is that Dick Cheney threatened to pull the plug on all of the cooperation, or the little bit of cooperation the White House was giving the Joint Congressional Inquiry. Now, it's interesting. Bob Graham has said, quote, "Looking back at it, I think we were clearly set up by Dick Cheney and the White House. They wanted to shut us down."
Yes.
And they wanted to shut down a legitimate congressional inquiry that might raise questions, in part, about whether their own people had aggressively pursued al-Qaeda in the days prior to the September 11th attacks. The vice president attempted to manipulate the situation, and he attempted to manipulate us. But if this was his goal, but if his goal was to get us to back off, he was unsuccessful. End quote.
Yeah, but it sent it sent a chilling message. I mean, it really put them on notice that if anybody was going to say anything, even if it was not actually classified. Remember, the whole thing about that, if it's knowingly compromising and there's no indication. I mean, the fact is, those messages did exist, but that was right at the very end. I mean, there have been many warnings prior to that were all, well, that gets into a whole other story. But
right, well, that's what I'm going to get.
That is true. They were not translated until the day after 9/11.
Okay, now you said
it's too late.
You spoke to the Joint Congressional Inquiry, and before we get into the 9/11 Commission, I wrote a little statement down to put this into context. Just so everybody knows, with regards to 9/11 and the NSA, the 9/11 Commission barely looked at them. The following is from historycommons.org, and I think it's from Phil Sheenan's book, The Commission. Quote, "For Executive Director Philip Zelikow and other staff on the Commission, it was just more interesting, sexier, to concentrate on the CIA," end quote. In late 2003, the NSA will allow the 9/11 Commission access to its archives on al-Qaeda. Quote, "Perversely, the more eager NSA Director General Hayden was to cooperate, the less interested 9/11 Commission Executive Director Philip Zelikow and others at the Commission seemed to be in what was buried in the NSA files," end quote. Now, towards the end of the 9/11 Commission, quote, "Zelikow would later admit he too was worried that important classified information had never been reviewed at the NSA and elsewhere in the government before the 9/11 Commission shut its doors, that critical evidence about bin Laden's terrorist network sat buried in government files, unread to this day. By July 2004, it was just too late to keep digging," end quote. Now, I think it's interesting, since he and others seemed to be the main reason the 9/11 Commission stayed away from the NSA. And some of the information that they did come across tried to tie Iran to al-Qaeda and 9/11. Yeah. You know, so now let's get to the next question, which is a really good one.
Sure.
You once said, quote, "I can't say fully because it's classified, but I showed that NSA knew a great deal about the 9/11 threats and al-Qaeda, electronically tracking various people and organizations for years, since its role is to collect intelligence. The problem is it wasn't sharing all of the data. If it had, other parts of government could have acted on it, and more than likely NSA could have stopped 9/11, end quote. Now, did you speak to the 9/11 Commission, and did you make them aware of this information that could have stopped 9/11?
I never spoke to the 9/11 Commission. I was never asked to speak. It's one of the interesting mysteries. I think I know why. I did speak extensively with the Joint Inquiry, which was a much broader examination by both House and Senate intelligence committees. It was triggered in part by an earlier investigation. It was the Saxby-Chambliss subcommittee on Homeland Security in the HPSI, who had an earlier investigation, which really was the basis for the Joint Inquiry. The Joint Inquiry was the one that was much more public. And I gave them extraordinary amounts of internal information, both as well written as well as oral testimony regarding what NSA knew prior to 9/11, as well as what was discovered after 9/11, including information that in an effort when I was the executive program manager for ThinThread, where we had an opportunity with some monies that had been actually approved at NSA to point ThinThread at the largest set of databases, the intelligence databases that existed. We're talking about multiple hundreds of terabytes of data and then some. And we discovered information that had never even been found that was true indications and warning, both pre and post 9/11. That entire effort was shut down. There's a whole story behind that, by the way. Was completely shut down. And I remember my program manager coming to me where he was ordered to take all of the program information for ThinThread and give it to this other organization. Effectively, you know, the image, the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you see the box going down and then turning left. And
right, yeah, I remember.
That's what happened to ThinThread. It was put into the NSA Indiana Jones digital warehouse.
Well, now, with regards to ThinThread, just so everybody understands, one of the crucial differences between this $3.2 million program and the $4 billion program was that it would have protected civil liberties. Am I correct?
It was built in. It was all probable cause. It was all based on targeting. It was not, and this has been a myth that somehow, you know, the NSA didn't want it because it was a mass surveillance program, which is the grand irony. It's sort of reverse projection. It's like project onto the very program that actually protected civil liberties and U.S. persons. In fact, it was all about, you know, it was all about real targeting, targeting of real threats. It was not about just sucking it all in. NSA, after 9/11, just simply said, we need the data. We don't care where we get it from. We just need it. Became obsessed with collecting the data. And that's one thing NSA is really good at, is collecting data. Making sense of it, that's a different story.
Well,
so this program had, by design, I can speak very directly on this because I not only did I analyze the code, the core code for ThinThread, but I also analyzed, because I was a system software engineer at the time, analyzed in the engineering design documents. And the design, and it was built into the code, was to protect U.S. persons. It was never thought, I mean, in wildest imaginations, that this program be stripped of its protections and turned on the United States.
Right.
That was just the last thing that we even considered.
Now, it concerns me that the 9/11 Commission did not really look at the NSA, and one of the reasons, obviously, is because the 9/11 Commission was mandated to give a, quote, full and complete accounting of the 9/11 attacks. And, you know, when they were sold to the world as the definitive account of 9/11, and they weren't. They simply were not. And so, you know, this is reason 1,002,000, you know, whatever, as to why the 9/11 Commission was a complete farce, and why, you know, there needs to be a real investigation with accountability and everything like that.
Well, I'll give you an indication as to what they want to keep. I can speak directly to my own situation. I can't speak to others. I'm well aware of other efforts. I'm well aware of programs like Able Danger, that in a whole nother effort on the Army side that was looking at this, but another one that got shut down as well and got in all kinds of quote unquote hot water. I can tell you this, to this day, the only record that exists that I had any connection to the joint inquiry investigation on 9/11 was the fact that I was interviewed.
Right.
All attempts to date, we're talking now 12 years later, okay, over 12 years ago, when all this, over a period of several months, but over 12 years ago, no one can find any record, any notes, or any material evidence that I gave investigators from the joint inquiry.
Well, that's awfully convenient.
All inquiries to date, all attempts to find it, end up in box canyons.
Well,
that should tell you something. At NSA, I can tell you, because I was in executive session a number of times, and I remember one with General Hayden during the 9/11 Commission, right? Now, so the 9/11 Commission is this quote-unquote independent commission that's going to be the be-all and end-all.
Right.
There was clearly agreements because of what had been, and I know this from my own material evidence, that we're not going to go in certain areas. We're going to avoid, and it was clear Hayden had, he had direct access to the White House, okay? And it was clear, I remember him chortling. He was chortling during executive session, as you might recall, during that period where the FBI and the CIA were taking a whole lot of heat from the 9/11 Commission, in public hearings.
Right.
And I remember him saying in executive session how nice it was to hide behind their coattails while the FBI and the CIA took the heat and NSA got to remain in the shadows. He knew NSA was culpable. He knew NSA was exposed. But he was a political general, and he had all kinds of top cover. And so they just conveniently chose not to really investigate NSA. And so I find it disingenuous, I'll be polite, on the part of the 9/11 commissioners and the executive director when they opine about we didn't get a whole lot of cooperation from NSA. That's because that was part of the agreement.
Right.
Okay. And that's another one of the deep secrets, is it was made. See, NSA, if there's any one, there was a systemic failure in terms of 9/11, and there's historical context. There's the systemic context in terms of the intelligence and the way intelligence, the establishment and the institutions, the need to know, even, if we don't know, if I give you information, I'm giving away my power. What are you going to do with it? There's all that crap, right? But here we have NSA had prima facie evidence, right? Electronic evidence, extraordinary. And then finding out later, as I did directly, right, through the analysis that was done, people coming to me with additional information, as well as the analysis that ThinThread did, finding out that there was more than just, passing information about Al-Qaeda and associated movements. And yet NSA directed at the highest levels to ensure that none of that information would ever get close to an investigator. They actually said that, which meant they were actually obstructing an official congressional investigation, and then obstructed the 9/11 Commission.
Then I'm going to skip ahead to a question. Was anybody at the NSA held accountable after 9/11 for their supposed failures? And if it was there, and James Banford actually answered this, he said there was not one, but was there an NSA Inspector General report on the NSA's, quote, failures? And can you tell me the name of the NSA IG at the time of 9/11 when all of the investigations were going on?
Joel Brenner was actually, he came in early 2002, late winters, early spring of 2002. He was the Inspector General at NSA during the joint inquiry.
Okay. Now, was anyone in NSA held accountable?
No.
Nobody was. Do you know, this is something that happened throughout the government, so I'll just ask you, were people that should have been held accountable rewarded and or promoted?
That's an understatement.
Within the NSA?
Both. Well, NSA, my gosh, I look at the career paths of all the people that I remember, all these seminal players that I either worked for, was hired by, or got to know during my time there. We're all promoted, richly rewarded, and the revolving door, they're cashing in big time.
Well,
or I've already cashed in big time, or continue to cash in big time. Look, screwing up, failing the nation. I remember the Navy supposedly, right, when I was, especially if you're at sea, the commander's supposed to take the hit. It was on your watch, right? It happened on your watch.
Right.
You're supposed to take responsibility for it. Hayden has never taken responsibility for any of the failures that fall at the feet of NSA. He just refuses to do so. It's like he pathologically refuses to accept any responsibility or any accountability for 9/11. And I know why, okay? Because he chose in his mind that he would put his stamp, his secret stamp on history. And his secret stamp on history was that NSA, and I mean, let me just give you a quote. I mean, I think it's illustrative for your listeners. Just to give you a 4-word response that he gave to Diane Warwick, which is actually, it's actually accounted for in the seminal article about my case, still to this date, written by Jane Mayer in a New Yorker article called "The Secret Share," with the question, me as an enemy of the state, question mark. In there is an account of Diane Warwick confronting Michael Hayden, General Hayden, in the summer, get this, during the period in which I was a material witness for the joint inquiry, confronts Hayden in the summer of 2002. And at the end of the conversation, after they're going back and forth, she's basically looking at him saying, why? Why did you do this? Which was just violate the Fourth Amendment. And he didn't. His answer is extraordinarily chilling. 4-word answer. We had the power.
Right. Well,
we had the power. Wow.
That's one of the things, you spoke about. One of the things Dick Cheney was very interested in doing was expanding executive power, which he feels dwindled over the years. And on the day of 9/11, one of the very first things he does is he calls his attorney, David Addington, and brings him back to the White House to discuss exactly how far, how much power the unitary executive, as you mentioned, could have.
9/11 was his convenient cover. 9/11 was, I mean, I can only imagine in his mind, he was, that Cheney grin. I can only imagine because, look, this is where people have to understand history. Cheney goes way back. Cheney well knew government. Cheney was, if there was any one person who understood how government works, it was Cheney from the inside out, and he knew the intelligence really, really well. You remember he had been the Secretary of Defense, back during the Persian Gulf War.
Chief of Staff to Ford.
Well, Chief of Staff to Ford, and this is the critical history. He always thought Nixon got a raw deal, and he has actually said this. People forget what he's flagged himself for years, right, as to where his inclinations lie. He said long time ago, way before 9/11, said that if he ever got into a position of power, came back into the government, that he would restore the imperial presidency. He would restore the presidency because he always thought Nixon got a raw deal. That the president, that the office of the president had been besmirched, had been tarnished, and that he would restore its glory. Well, guess what? He was given the national security portfolio, hook, line, and sinker, or lock, stock, and barrel, right, by Bush himself. Bush is a total neophyte in terms of national security. And so, that was also engineered. It was the fact that Cheney was even his vice president was engineered.
Right.
Because he was actually the head of the selection committee and figured the only person who was qualified was himself, which, I find that quite revealing.
I do.
So here he is now with an opportunity to very quickly restore the glory of the office of the president and bring back all those powers that were, quote unquote, that contained and constrained the executive. As a result, we keep forgetting all of those scandals and the fact that the government had in secret violated the rights of Americans on a routine basis for many, many years, if not decades, actually going back to the end of World War II.
Absolutely.
And people forget that history. They forget about FBI's COINTELPRO. They forget about CIA's Operation Chaos. They forget about NSA's Minaret and Shamrock. They forget about all those programs.
You just brought up COINTELPRO, and one of the first things John Ashcroft did after 9/11, and you mentioned the church hearings where the COINTELPRO was exposed, he reinstated COINTELPRO.
Yes.
Now, one of the things, we spoke of warnings, and I don't know if you remember, but after 9/11, we were told repeatedly that there was absolutely no warnings, that nobody had any idea that anything like this was going to happen. And now, one of the questions I have for you, there was or is, I don't know if it's still around, a system at the NSA known as Echelon. It has been described as, quote, a global system for the interception of private and commercial communications, end quote. There are allegations concerning the usage of Echelon for corporate espionage, among other things. With regards to 9/11, and this is from historycommons.org, it says that in June 2001, quote, German intelligence warns the CIA, Britain's intelligence agency, and Israel's Mossad that Middle Eastern militants are planning to hijack commercial aircraft to use as weapons to attack, quote, American and Israeli symbols which stand out, end quote. A later article quotes unnamed German intelligence sources who state the information was coming from Echelon surveillance technology and that British intelligence had access to the same warnings, end quote. Do you know if the allegations regarding that warning is true? And also, were you aware that in 2001, the European Parliament released a report on Echelon?
I am very aware, and I've read the full report from the European Parliament. It all got, because of 9/11, no one ever really picked up on it at that point. Echelon was, look, I mean, I was in the system, as we're talking about the latter years of the Cold War. Echelon was an extraordinary intelligence sharing system that between what we call the Five Eyes. So you had the United States, Great Britain, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and I know that system real well and well aware of sort of the dark side of the system where it was used for other purposes because information is power, right? So it wasn't just foreign intelligence; you got to use it for other things. That system was reignited, I'll put it that way mildly, after 9/11.
Right.
Okay. And because of the advances in technology, it was one of the mechanisms that existed between those five countries for intelligence sharing on an extraordinary scale. I cannot speak directly in terms of personal knowledge of the warnings, although I was aware of warnings that had been provided. But let me tell you this. The warning, just because another country, see, here's the thing. If another country gives a warning, and this is sort of the arrogance and hubris of power, well, it's not our warning, it's your warning. And so it doesn't have the same equivalent resonance because it's coming from somewhere else. Well, and you have to remember the system. These were warnings, it's true. You had the Bohica going back to 95. Remember all this stuff that took place between even the original attempt to drop the World Trade Center towers from 93 all the way up through 2001. You had the Cole bombing. You had Kabar towers. You had all these other terrorist incidents, but you also had other threats and warnings. All of this, and you had Tenet saying the system was blinking red 3 years before 9/11. None of that made a difference. Here's why. The system was designed as a Cold War system, a symmetric system. It was not designed for asymmetric. It was not designed for having large amounts of information. It wasn't designed for that. So you have an irony here that the Echelon system, which came out of the Cold War, was collecting massive amounts of information. You had beyond Echelon, you had all the other systems. All this stuff is just piling up, and people are trying to make sense of it. So someone gives a warning in the middle of all this. What does it mean, right? It's just some warning that, some unspecified threat. There might be some militants or some radicalized element. Remember what I said the general said back in 1993? Who cares, right? This was largely dismissed except for a very small cadre of analysts recognizing the growing threat separate from the historical roots for all this, right? And their attempted redress for grievances, which was turning into mass casualty attacks of a spectacular nature, and they kept ramping it up. It was well known. I will flat out tell you that using airplanes, we have the history of hijacking, for Christ's sake.
Right.
So using airplanes as weapons, right, was not it was not as, and this is where Condi Rice is just covering up herself. No one could have imagined, right? No one could have imagined. That's not true. Not just wasn't it, no one could have, people did imagine it, and there was actual active plots to bring down airliners.
Right.
So you can imagine, and now I pause because of what I ended up finding out shortly after 9/11, and then what I discovered from others at NSA, then found in NSA's own databases regarding the core threat here. It was asymmetric. That's the problem. It wasn't NSA. It really didn't have the full capability or capacity to bring together asymmetric, unassociated bits of information and make sense of them in context. And so it was fragmented picture. It was always fragmented. It was never enough. It never rose to the threshold of it. Even though Tenet said the light was blinking red, it never rose to a level that said, you know what? This is a real threat. We have to align the institution to deal with it. And that did not happen.
Well, there are, do you remember the August 6th presidential daily briefing, which was called Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the U.S.? Yeah. That got a lot of attention during the 9/11 Commission, but we found out from Kurt Eichenwald that the PDBs that came before it made the August 6th PDB pale in comparison, as compared to, with the information that was within them. Now, isn't this, I guess, the information that is it within the PDB that partly comes from the NSA, does it not?
More than just partly. It's fair to say, having been part of a process when I was at the CIA, when I was an imagery analyst down what was then NPIC, National Photographic Interpretation Center, and then later at the Pentagon, but especially when I was at the CIA, where there's a whole process for how information gets into the president's daily brief, the PDP. I've known any number of people that have actually worked directly on it. It's sort of the senior analysts from the respective intelligence agency. As we moved into the information age, analog, digital age, right, with internet, more and more of the intelligence that was in the president's daily brief was a higher and higher percentage of it. The good stuff was coming from signals intelligence.
Right.
And the reason is because, more and more people are communicating electronically, okay? And so it would stand to reason that by virtue of where intelligence is coming from, both secret as well as from open systems, upwards, and it's probably, I would hear different figures. NSA used to brag about it internally that, 90% of the good stuff comes from us, right? Let no one forget it. Like it's sort of bragging rights with the rest of the agencies. It's probably fair to say that a good 2/3 plus. I can't give you specifics because you'd have to go back and analyze every single one if you want to do it accurately. But let's just say that a significant majority of the core intelligence, sort of indications and warning intelligence, was based in part or as primary from signals intelligence.
Okay, now
but see here, this is part of the problem. You end up blinding yourself. Okay, and I say SIGINT. Notice, because I used to work at DIA when I was in the Navy. I was assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency at the Pentagon. They're the ones that were actually responsible as an agency for the National Military Joint Intelligence Center. So you get blind to your own int. And you dismiss any other information that may discount it or may amplify it or may be from a different source because you are, quote unquote, the source. So you tend not to include by virtue of accepting it. You accept it, you only include it when it actually aligns with your own sources and methods. And remember, the irony here at NSA was a technical collective agency when it was formed in 1952. It was never designed to do finished intelligence. And yet they took on the prerogative that we can understand SIGINT because it's really complex stuff. So we will interpret it so you can understand it.
Okay. Now, with regards to that report from Parliament, I just want to read this little clip I got. Quote, a report issued by the European Parliament last week advises the use of encryption software to protect electronic communications against the Echelon spy network. Against continued U.S. denials, the report concluded that the spy network does exist and that its primary purpose is to intercept private and commercial communications, not military intelligence, end quote. And that is from WSWS.org, June 6th, 2001.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to get into the next question.
Sure.
And I hope I say this correctly. There was a communications hub in Sana'a, Yemen, that was used by Al-Qaeda for many years. It was apparently used for the U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the USS Cole bombing, and for 9/11. This communications hub was extensively monitored by the NSA. Can you tell us about this hub?
Yeah, the hub existed. NSA have been monitoring probably since at least 1996. I gave extraordinary amounts of material evidence to both, but particularly the joint inquiry regarding this hub and the fact, based on other information, that NSA knew precisely what numbers were calling into that hub and when the hub was calling out to other numbers. And that included the two hijackers that were living in San Diego.
Well, that gets to my next question. Two of the hijackers living in San Diego made several calls to the communications hub in Yemen. The Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11 says that, quote, the NSA did not realize the hijackers were in the U.S. at the time the calls were made, end quote. And on June 4th, 2014, Abby Martin had two NSA whistleblowers on her show during Breaking the Set. They are William Binney and Kirk Wiebe. And during this interview, William Binney tells us, quote, I know specifics, like 6 or 7 phone calls from San Diego back to the Yemen facility. And by the way, both ends were known. I mean, both numbers were there. That's how caller ID works. End quote. Now, can you tell us if this means that the NSA lied to the Joint Congressional Inquiry and knew the hijackers were in the United States and didn't bother to tell the FBI?
NSA lied. Yeah, look, this has come up before. I've yet to actually say this because I've never been asked, except the joint inquiry. Of course, I've never been asked after all this, even after in the last number of years, even after the Ridenhour article from 2005. No one has yet to invite me before a congressional committee because obviously there's been no investigation since. All right. Anyway, yeah, NSA flat out lied about this. They knew what the numbers were, but remember, they're numbers, all right? And these numbers are, well, their numbers point back to where they come from. It's the way the system works. You cannot be monitoring the hub without knowing what the other number is, because that's what you're monitoring, right? Obviously, you know what the number is for the hub, and when a number comes in, you know what the ID of the number is that's coming in.
Okay.
I'll say it that way. Here's where you get in institutional equities. I know some people think of conspiracy theories and other things, right? And there are conspiracies, all right? But here is where people have to understand the culture, right? Part of the problem here is that you had other parts of the government that were attempting to make these hijackers informants, all right? And you get into a really, really weird set of mirrors where the government is actually working against itself. And obviously, when it came to the domestic sphere, because of other restrictions, NSA cannot operate there. Although I will tell you, given the nature, if it rises to a threat sufficient enough, you go to the court, you got resident legal aliens living in the United States, you go to the secret court, you can do the equivalent of cast iron, as we would call it in the business, cast iron coverage. You, as NSA, have FBI go up to the court and say, yes, we're going to monitor this phone call or phone numbers. And it was more than just a couple. But they didn't, okay? They didn't, because you got this other operation going on, right? You also had the CI that was, quote unquote, tracking certain of the hijackers, certain meetings in Malaysia, lost track. You know, then they're in the United States. You got the FBI actually doing surveillance, right, on the very hijackers, okay, because they are in the loop. And yet, and then you've got Colleen Rowley, remember, from the Minneapolis, where now they're getting trained to fly airplanes, but only to, quote unquote, land, not to take off.
Well, there was an FBI agent, Michael Maltby. They were actually turned on to people training at flight schools in Arizona. I think it was Moussaoui. They identified Moussaoui. The flight school is actually called the FBI.
Yes.
And Michael Maltby, was warning people left and right that people were training.
Yep.
He was
in a strange manner. Yes.
He actually, I think he predicted.
Yep.
That planes would be used as weapons and so on and so forth. So that there's a lot of information about the FBI. And with regards to the CIA, trying to get those two hijackers as informants, I think, isn't that just a theory that was posited as to the reasons why the CIA essentially protected those two hijackers?
Well, I don't think it protected them. I just think they had Alex stationed. I mean, they had the Bin Laden unit. I mean, you can talk. I've never met him or spoke to him, Michael Scheuer, although there's others in the loop as well.
Go ahead.
Here's the kabuki dance: is that they're all kind of running their own ops, right? They're not. Remember, I have to say it again for your listening audience. There was a disincentive for any of these agencies to share what they knew with each other. And so you have the sort of the classic, who's the famous author with the elephant story, where one was on the trunk and one was on the leg, and one was on the tail, and they're all trying to figure out what it is, right? And if they just share the information with each other, they would figure out that it was an elephant. Okay.
My problem with that is that if individuals made decisions to withhold information that could have prevented the attacks, then those individuals should have been held accountable, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but see, it's an institutional thing, because you're talking about analysts who are concerned enough about what's happening, and they go up through channels. Look, I'll give you the example that I know directly. Right after 9/11, I had an analyst, very agitated, come to me in secret at great risk. They even told me that. They knew that I worked directly for the Signals Intelligence Director. They came to me with the report that I made reference to earlier. Very large report. It had been many months in the making. It was all done in early 2001, and they were never allowed to share it with anybody else in the community. They come to me with this report. They actually gave me a copy of it, okay, both electronic and hard copy. I go to the Signals Intelligence Director with this copy, and the response told me everything. I wish you had never brought this to my attention. Remember, this is after 9/11. The last thing NSA wanted to do was admit its own failure. They did not want to admit that they actually knew something now that 9/11 had happened, and then have to fess up about it.
Right. And
I know this directly because, again, there's so much more to this story than we're even talking about right now. I was when the Saxby-Chambliss subcommittee 9/11 inquiry, which was the harbinger for the joint, they announced in December 2001. They started interviewing witnesses and doing interviews at NSA in early 2002. I was asked by Maureen Baginski to take the lead at NSA, enterprise level lead, to work a statement for the record that which NSA would come before Saxby-Chambliss' subcommittee and because they were asking all the right questions. The actual questions that the subcommittee was asking were all right. Like, what had happened? We can't ever let this happen again. Now, we had this whole edifice put into place to prevent another, we were supposed to preclude another Pearl Harbor, electronic Pearl Harbor, right? Would never happen again. Well, it did in the digital age. So why? NSA, of course, is in the bullseye on this by virtue of its own capability, its own technology, its own capacities. So I had a team, right? I had a virtual team, plus I had one of the people on my own team. We were burning the midnight oil and then some over the space of about 2 weeks to put together the statement for the record. And we went to the ends of NSA to find out everything there was to know about what we could have known, should have known, and did know prior to 9/11 and even after 9/11. Because it is true that after 9/11, NSA did a comprehensive sweep using its corporate technology. I have to qualify this. Go back into the databases, right, to find out anything that we might have missed, right? Of course, the things they missed, they buried. That's part of the obstruction of, that's a fact. They actually knew things, okay, that were discovered by their traditional systems, and they chose not to share it because it meant that they knew something that, because they had it but didn't know it, would have made them look really, really bad, right? So they chose to simply say, we're not going to share that with the investigators. So I've got this responsibility, and I'm overseas on another effort, okay? I get this frantic phone call from my direct report, all right? And because I'm their direct report. So I get this frantic phone call and saying, we've been taken off the effort. And I say, why? Well, you're going to have to ask Maureen Baginski, when you get back. And so I do. I come back from overseas. I confront her in a leadership meeting, right? Mm-hmm. And she says, I'll have to take that offline with you. And so I confront her privately in her office, and she says, it's a data integrity problem. A data integrity problem. Mm-hmm. Yes. What an interesting phrase to use as a euphemism to cover up the truth, because what we discovered, we'd included, the early report, other amplifying reports, additional information, of course, that had come to light since 9/11. Here it is, late February of 2002, and they've shut down the effort, and they're now in full cover-up mode with an official 9/11 congressional investigation. Wow. I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, that to me, and so I have some people, well, I said, I was there, I saw that from my end happen. Other people have attempted to say, well, there's got to be, they had this information, knew it, and withheld it on purpose to set it up where the 9/11 would happen to be. It's like, no, it was not. That was not the case. It just wasn't. There's been no evidence, credible evidence ever brought to me, okay, that there was some kind of conspiracy here, when in fact it was people in power who didn't want to admit failure, right? And people in power who should have known better. People in power, and their arrogance and hubris, were not listening to the people that were doing the real work. The people that were doing the real work were warning people in power, you know what? There's a threat here. This threat has existed for a long time. And not only was the system blinking red, it was now in your face, and you just chose not to admit it. And so then the evidence comes forward to prove it, and you simply shut it all down. You cut off your own face in the mirror, right? Which is it's this reverse psychology, because you actually are culpable and you refuse to accept any responsibility for it. Well, so what you end up doing, and this is what happened, now you get to the whistleblower side of me, is you now ensure that we're going to make life as difficult as possible for anybody who dares reveal the truth about what NSA actually knew, could have known, or should have known. Look, I gave the joint inquiry, I'm going to use really strong language, I gave the joint inquiry the smoking gun evidence, okay? It's smoking gun. You wonder why, after 12 years, no one can find the evidence in the archives, that the only record that exists is I was interviewed, but there's no other accompanying information? You wonder why, even during my own criminal trial, when we attempted to get information, all the evidence I gave, yet another investigation that took place over several years with the Department of Defense Office Inspector General, when the chief prosecutor comes back and says, oh, all that evidence has been destroyed as part of a document destruction policy, when in fact they did that on purpose. Wow. You really have to wonder, because they were so hyper about protecting their quote unquote reputation. Well, it was okay. Institutionally, they had the power, and so we're going to blame the messenger. We're gonna shoot the messenger, and not deal with the message.
One of the things that the Bush administration, they had two choices after 9/11. They could either take responsibility for the failures within the government, or they could deny everything and cover their asses, and they chose the latter. And that's one of the reasons why there are conspiracy theories out there, is because of the fact that, you know, they covered up everything. And
that is the conspiracy. Remember, I will tell you, there's a lot of other indicators. Obviously, there was a memo being circulated even during the transition, the presidential transition team, the PTT, late December of 2000, early 2001, before Bush takes the oath for the office, and with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and there was a memo circulated where NSA was looking for relief in terms of the Fourth Amendment probable cause standard. All right, no one really thought much about it then, but that was already being circulated. Clearly, those that were coming into power wanted to have additional powers. But I will tell you, this is where I actually accept much of what Richard Clarke has said, right? Where counterterrorism simply was not on the radar. It was not considered, in spite of all of the evidence. It was just not a focus. It just wasn't. Well, and even when, remember, just because there's a warning, just because there's an indication of something happening, or there's a planned attack, when it's not specific enough, right? I don't actually see a tank. I can't see an airplane, okay? Right? And even though there's the warnings and there was already the interdictions of certain plans, like the Bohica thing over the Pacific, right? It was a very comprehensive plan that got broken up. Or the Millennium thing, right? All of that, right, was still not sufficient. Right, and that's the burden. That's the burden that I carry. But the conspiracy this is why it's worse in part. We talk about the real conspiracy. One, 9/11 was a trigger to subvert the Constitution. Now we have to cover up that we're subverting the Constitution. Two, cover up the actual evidence that we actually had, and particularly at NSA, but clearly elsewhere as well, FBI, CIA. That could have, if it had been shared properly, the way it was supposed to be shared within the system, the way in which I was trained to share it, right up into and including the President of the United States, through what's called the critic system, where it has to land on his desk in 10 minutes, right? The problem was you had all these layers, and they just didn't rise to that occasion. It would make us look bad. It was not something that was, remember, it's asymmetric. They were not, the institution was not designed to respond to asymmetric indications and warning. And that was a systemic failure. So now you've pulled up the mirror with the smoking gun evidence, and what do?
Destroy it.
That's correct. And then they go after the very people who would dare do so, right? And that includes me, okay?
Right. Well, I don't know exactly what the Bush administration knew. I mean, we don't have access to the presidential daily briefings. As far as them not taking the threat of terrorism seriously, the reason was they were preparing, for the Iraq War. They were, first of all, the neocons within the Bush administration were telling Bush that the threat was not Al-Qaeda, but was instead Saddam Hussein.
That's right.
And I remember reading the CIA sent in one of the presidential daily briefings, I think the CIA actually said that, no, this is not disinformation, as the neocons were telling Bush. There is an actual threat out there. And there's a lot of questions out there as to what they knew, and I unfortunately can't tell you what they knew because I'm just a regular citizen. I don't have subpoena power, and so on and so forth. Um, Now, the last question I'm going to ask you.
Well, I can tell you, it's okay if I just insert here parenthetically.
Sure, go ahead.
Look, their focus when they came into office was not counterterrorism. Their focus was actually Iraq. Their focus and the quote unquote, the three countries. Remember the three countries? The axis of evil.
Yes.
Isn't it interesting that axis of evil is still in part the same axis and slightly modified?
Well, they actually, because of the fact that there has never been an investigation into 9/11 that didn't have its own version of compromise and corruption,
Yep.
they can actually point to any country and say, yeah, they were involved in 9/11. And that's
Yep.
what they've done, essentially. The Taliban in February of 2001 actually offered to hand over Osama bin Laden.
Yes.
I don't know what happened with that. They blamed the Taliban after 9/11 for harboring Al Qaeda, and now the Taliban is back in power greatly in Afghanistan.
More opium is being produced now in Afghanistan. I mean, than ever before. I mean, it's just it's extraordinary, and it's just this is what I call the entrails of empire. I mean, it is extraordinary, and I served. Remember, I was gosh, there's so much to talk about here, but I just
I know,
because there's so many other threads here. I mean, just think of someone, special forces in Afghanistan at Tora Bora. And what if I shared with you? Although books have been written about this from people actually there. But remember, I used to be an analyst. I had wide purview, lots of connections. That's where I came from, that space. You're at Tora Bora. You have all the intelligence. You've got Osama bin Laden and his closest associates, okay, all surrounded. And then you're given these mysterious orders coming down from the DOD to pull assets out because guess what? The higher priority is Iraq. We need to prepare for Iraq.
Right. Well, they essentially allowed Osama to escape from Tora Bora.
That's correct.
Now
you tell me. I mean, people, I can't speak directly to that because I was not there in the field. But I can tell you people that I have spoken with and others, okay, who I knew that have spoken, right, were just beside themselves.
Well, there were other instances, throughout before 9/11 that it seemed that Osama bin Laden had been protected. Michael Scheuer, I think, even wrote about or talked about how there were 10 different instances where he had bin Laden in his sights and was told to back off.
There is a weird thing with when you have it's convenient to keep someone alive. It's sort of this weird old west, dead or alive.
Right.
Once they're dead, right, then they no longer have the same kind of resonance in terms of all the efforts you need. Because once they're dead, then what do? You shut down all the posses?
Right. Well, obviously, if they had gotten them in November 2001, we didn't have a reason to go to have the war on terror anymore.
Precisely.
But
precisely.
That in itself is just criminal. Now,
but see, so imagine those of us seeing all this play out from the inside, how it's being manipulated at the highest levels of our government. Of course, you had genuflecting media, right, parroting, basically stenographers,
right,
press is stenographers of the government, and being embedded and given special briefings and off the record briefings, anonymous briefings. You saw what the New York Times did with Iraq. Okay, so it really, you saw what happened with James Rice-Lichtblau with the warrantless wiretapping program, the domestic.
Right.
where they knew they had this information for 14 months, even back prior to the 2004 elections. For national security reasons, New York Times editor said, nope, we're not going to publish.
Right. And it was the Bush administration that asked them specifically not
Yeah.
to.
What does that tell you when you got the government now manipulating the press because they want a particular outcome? Or the thing with Judy Miller, that was all manipulated. Cheney is actually saying what's being reported based on what he actually gave them.
Right.
Well, that's convenient. Wow.
I know. Now, according to Michael Isikoff and David Korn, sometime between 2001 and 2002, Scooter Libby's office was reading, quote, unvetted transcripts of National Security Agency intercepts, end quote. Scooter Libby was the chief of staff for Vice President Dick Cheney. According to the New Yorker, quote, policymakers are not supposed to have direct access to raw intelligence. The information is supposed to first be scrutinized and vetted by professional analysts in the intelligence community to ensure that the information is sound. This filtering process, which has been in place for some 50 years, is also intended to prevent intelligence from being used to service a particular political agenda, end quote. Do you know if Scooter Libby's office was reading these transcripts before 9/11? It's something they don't make very clear.
I can tell you, I can't give you specifics, and I don't actually know the specifics about Scooter Libby directly, okay? Because in some ways, he was a chief of staff, okay? He was a functionary, very high-level functionary to do Cheney's bidding.
Right.
He's also a convenient cutout as well because he can be used as cover, and we know that from the Valerie Plame situation.
Right.
Right, where he's the one that, quote-unquote, will take the fall for his boss, all right? Yeah. Well, the fact remains that even before 9/11, Cheney wanted his own intelligence. He didn't trust, okay? He knew the bureaucracy really well. He wanted a direct pipeline, so that's what he set up. He set up his own, essentially, covert line to the White House. So the White House is now on special distro, to say it that way, special distro for the kind of intelligence that he wants. And he was obviously able to get Hayden, who had no problem pleasing his boss. That's the one thing, Hayden was pleasing his boss was job number one.
Right.
So he gave him the intelligence as well as and George Tenet. In fact, it's more even. I think Hayden was more political about it. Tenet just wanted to please his boss, period. Remember the slam dunk thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, okay.
There was a pipeline even before 9/11.
I honestly, I want Dick Cheney and George Bush on the stand under oath separately, taking questions about a lot of things.
They have the equivalent of sovereign immunity. They're the last thing they're going to do is open up a huge can of worms in terms of it's going to be I'm afraid it will be left up to the longer arc of history to put all this into its light. Some people said wake up, decades or centuries from now and look back, whatever the history is of that day, and say, what were we thinking?
Wow.
See, none of this had to happen, and yet here you see at the highest levels of government using what was an extraordinary, day of 3,000 people being murdered, failing to protect the country, and yet using that as an excuse to take us, as we now know, down many, many dark paths.
We're still going through,
and then thinking people, and I think maybe the false hope and the false hope and desire for change in electing Obama as president, thinking that he was not Bush, let alone Cheney, and then finding out that he's now institutionalizing.
Well, that's one of the things is that when you give power to the executive office, that office is never going to give up that power.
he's admitted as much quite in his own way. You know, he has this way of sort of wrapping himself in his own robes of moral rectitude, and somehow he's the president, but he knows already what it's like in terms of history, and so then he analyzed himself. That, you know, yes, I said all that, but then I became president, and you're not. I became president, and you're not. And because you're not the president, you don't know what I now know. And because I know what I now know, well, things are different.
Well,
he told Jon Stewart on the Daily Show some months ago, which I think people never really picked up on this, that he was already considering his legacy, and that he wanted to have this legal framework in place. The last time I checked, the only legal framework that he is obligated under a special oath, okay, to preserve, protect, and defend is the Constitution. Right. There is no other legal framework.
Well, that's, you know, you're very big into the Constitution, obviously, and he's a supposed constitutional lawyer, to boot. So,
but see, he is. I recognize his seminal place in at least U.S. history and obviously partially world history. What will history ultimately say?
That he continued and expanded on all of Bush's worst policies.
Well, but even Bush actually said in his own memoir that all this stuff, like the surveillance stuff in particular, of course, which is closest to me, there's a whole lot of other things, including torture, which, you know, became this world-girdling state-sponsored program of just egregious proportions.
Right.
And that's, you know, the CIA, infiltrating or masking themselves as committee members, right? Committee staffers to see what they're reporting on. Yeah, they got stuff to cover up. Tribes, you know, Hayden lied. It's clear, absolutely lied before the committee about this some years ago. So yeah, in terms of history, yeah, it's, you know, if you're presiding over, you know, it's extraordinary power. You're right. You're not going to want to give it up. I was too close. I have to say, it's just, I saw what happened to people. This kind of power is extremely seductive. And when Bush handed Obama all of the state secrets and all that surveillance on a silver platter, Obama looked at it and said, you know what? I'm going to keep that.
Right. Now, what advice do you have for people who might be considering to blow the whistle on something?
Ooh, wow. Given what I went through, you better first engage with an attorney that's really experienced, a criminal defense attorney, who's really experienced in this space first. And second, also engage the services of a whistleblower support advocacy group, like the Government Accountability Project, where I ultimately went, but of course after the fact, okay? Because I knew when I was indicted, facing 35 years in prison, that they've been hanging over my head all those many years, many attempts to get me to plead out, to many years in prison, as it turns out. Again, another much longer, deeper backstory here. I knew that it'd be challenging enough to deal with Maine Justice, and especially with William Welsh as their chief prosecutor. I knew it'd be challenging enough dealing with my defense, my criminal defense. And of course, I had run out of money with my private attorney, so I had public defenders. I knew I had to find a way to influence the court of public opinion. I just didn't know at that time how I would do that. I just knew that I needed to. And I knew that I couldn't say, because anything I said during the pre-trial criminal proceedings could be used against me.
Right.
So, long story short, is I engaged because Jesselyn Radack, who heads up the National Security Human Rights program at the Government Accountability Project, wrote this extraordinary op-ed in the LA Times shortly after I was indicted, and I recognized finally someone gets what's at stake here. As she had been a whistleblower herself during the early years of the Bush administration, like I was. But her case went public quite rapidly in the spring of 2002. So I engaged with Gap. She became a representing whistleblower attorney, and she defended me in the court of public opinion and became my voice when I had none. So if you're a whistleblower, and there are other organizations as well, depending on the type of whistleblowing you do, there are several channels as well. But of course, in my case, I was facing prison as a felon. So it's really important, particularly in light of what's happened under Obama. I mean, it's important to know Bush never actually indicted anybody. The investigation of me did start in 2006 and went on for 4 years before I was ultimately indicted. But he himself said, I meant to say this earlier, he in his own memoirs said, with respect to surveillance, oh, it's just a policy difference. Why should anybody go to prison? A policy difference, even making reference to the torture program.
Right.
A policy difference? Well, for Obama, apparently for him, we've got to set some examples. We got to fry some people, like really do it. And under Holder, Lanny Brewer was the supervising official for Welsh. Welsh was given the Espionage Act portfolio, and we're going to burn some people. And they borrowed some investigations that remained open from Bush, started some of their own. And here we are, 6 years now into his administration, and I've sort of lost count, 8, 9 indictments, either being charged or indicted for espionage, and many people that you never even hear about that were threatened.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Well, that's during the Bush administration, and it's funny that you mentioned this. Cindy Sheehan. I don't know if you're familiar with her. I guess you are. Okay. She even said that during the Bush administration, she would get arrested and they would let her go. Now, I have personal experience with Cindy Sheehan of being arrested under the Obama administration, and they made an example of us. They actually gave us a stay-away order that said if we went anywhere within a certain area of the White House that we would face 6 months in prison. These kinds of things didn't happen under the Bush administration.
No, they didn't. I mean, I keep reminding people of this. I think some people, are in denial because it's like, wait a minute, he was supposed to be different. Then there's sort of this dyspepsia of the political soul. It's like, who did we vote for? Who did we support? Look what's happening on it. He's actually expanded all of this,
right? And
it's protecting, not look backwards to prosecute those who want to make examples of because they dared speak truth to enough power. But we're definitely not, in all other respects, not only we're going to look forward, we're going to expand the horizon.
Right.
What the heck is that? I mean,
it's horrible. It's one of the reasons I like to point out the fact that we were lied to about 9/11 is to take away the justification for what's happening. Anyway.
And then you have the whole complex. I mean, I'll leave you, there is this huge elephant, there still is, and most people still don't want to touch it. Eisenhower warned the nation, during his farewell address in 1961 about the rise of the military-industrial complex, and people even this, like, what is he really talking about? They kind of dismissed it. Those words really, really do ring in my ear so often nowadays because, you have people like Hayden who cashed in big time with the Chertoff group. You've got Alexander who was even more bold about it. You saw what happened. It's been published that he had quote unquote hired the chief technology officer from NSA for 20 hours a week while he's still working full time at NSA. I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, it's just we're selling out national security, that cybersecurity and all of this is just a way to make all kinds of money for the 1%. I mean, this is what's happened. I mean, it's just become a huge growth industry, and people don't want that, that gravy train to end. They just don't.
Well, certain people don't. I certainly do.
Well, no, certain people, but the certain people are in incredible positions of power.
Oh, you don't have to tell me. I know.
And those people that are in power also are ensuring that those in the corporate side are protected. And more often than not, they're just going back and forth. I mean, Mike McConnell is like the exemplar of how this works. I know him because he was the NSA director in from 92 to 96. He was a Navy admiral. He retires. He goes to Booz Allen, where I was working. He was on my promotion committee to management level. Okay, I first met him. Actually, we're standing side by side in the men's room. That's how I actually met him. Okay, so he's at Booz. He gets the call, right? Making buku bucks, right? Gets the call to become the DNI. Comes back to serve his country one more time, right?
Right.
Then goes right back to Booz Allen. I mean, it's just, it's like...
Yep, it's horrible.
And all that knowledge, all that information is power, and that can be converted into money. And the temptations are huge. I still remember a very senior manager in a particular defense company coming to my office when I was still at NSA, offered me 4 times my salary, okay, which at that time was $130K plus. Says, we'll give you a base salary 4 times that you make now. He was talking $600,000 before bonuses. Wow. Just come work for us. We need someone like you. And I said, you keep talking, I'm going to turn you into the contracting office. And he said, oh, no one ever treated me like this. And he backed out of my office quite quickly. I mean, he was like figuring, dangle enough money in front. Well, that's happened. I had colleagues, colleagues that said, Tom, I can form my own company. I can hire about 5 or 6 people and $1 million bucks. Boom, just like that.
I respect people very highly who cannot be bought. I try to associate with as many of them as possible. Is there any help that you need? And if so, how can people help you?
Well, help me. Wow. It's been extraordinary. I mean, I don't talk about this much. I mean, I went into severe debt. There's a lot that I'm free, but what price you put on freedom?
Well, is there anywhere that anybody can go to donate to help you, or?
There's no specific site to donate. If anybody wants to donate, then I encourage them, and there is a government accountability project, is to donate to their fund and designate it for national security and human rights. That's what I can share with your listeners, because that organization, they, in terms of, if you're talking about, boxing, as limited a budget as they have, which is shoestring budget, and as few people as they have, they fight several classes above their weight. Okay, mm-hmm. And that's right now, as you asked me, that's what I would do. I have sought other work. But no one. It's really interesting when you become a whistleblower in this space, and given the publicity, is like many people, even people that should know better, it's like, well, we're afraid if we hire you because you're a whistleblower. It's sort of it's either stated indirectly or quite directly. I've yet to find any other work besides what I do right now, which pretty much everybody knows that knows me in this space or has heard about me knows that I work at an Apple store, an extraordinary place to work. But it's certainly a lot different than what I used to do.
You are probably the only legitimate genius at an Apple store in the entire company.
Well, I'm actually an expert there.
Okay.
But yeah, and I'm still there, okay, because I have to work. I'm a wage grade employee. I have to work. I've got bills. I understand. But for me, there's a larger context here. For me, what's at risk is our very liberty and our very sovereignty. And the last thing that I'm going to do is remain silent. And so that's why I've dedicated the rest of my life to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's why I don't think that you are a failure, because you said earlier that you failed, and I think the history is still being written as to whether or not people like you. People like Colleen Rowley, who, by the way, I want to thank very much for making this interview possible. She is a wonderful human being and a brave individual in her own right.
Sure is. No, I know her well. I've spoken in several forums with her. There was a period there not long after 9/11, 2002, 2003, where she was actually acknowledged with a couple others as a sort of the year of the whistleblower, and then that all, then whistleblowers became, persona non grata.
Right.
One other thing I would tell you, listeners, you will find this interesting. It should tell you how challenging it is for me and others. I'm actually writing a book about all of this, recognizing the constraints I'm under because of where I used to work. But I'm writing a book about all of this with Jesselyn Radack, and it's going on 3 years now and still cannot find a publisher.
Oh, believe me, I wrote a book. I wrote a book in the late 2011, and I could not find a publisher. And so I just self-published because I wanted the information out there. It was more important for me to get the information out there than it was to get a publisher and so forth.
Well, that's a route that I will consider sort of as a last resort. And there are some new leads that have come my way that I'm going to run down over the next few months. But
well, I want to thank you, Mr.
Sure.
Drake, for doing what you did. And for being on my show. It's an honor and a privilege. Again, thank you very much for your time today. I hope people learn something from this.
Well, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you very much, and you have a good night.
Yeah, take care now.
Bye-bye.